Hey guys, welcome back. Today I just wanted to do a little update video for you. A long time ago I posted a video, I've posted several I think, of how I create my own traveler's notebooks. Today I just want to do a little update video. I was going to sit down and make some notebooks for myself. I figured I would turn the camera on and show you my process because honestly it is so simple. Once you start, you will be obsessed. You will never buy another notebook again. They are so easy to make. What you're going to need is a few basic supplies. So you need something for a cover, something for your internal pages, and something to bind it with. Now, the previous video, I'll link it up here. It was from a long time ago. I used to use staples, and probably for the last couple of years, my preference has moved away from staples as a binding method. I just find them a little bit unstable, especially in a notebook that gets a lot of use. The holes around those staples can tend to tear a little bit. My preference now is definitely for a stitched notebook, so I'm going to show you how I do that. Now, as far as a cover goes, you are only limited by your imagination. Today, I'm just going to use 12 by 12 cardstock. You could use pattern paper. You could use a mixed media piece that you've created. Like, literally, you can use anything you have on hand for a cover. I mean, at a push, you could use, like, just scrap packaging, you know, from a cereal box or something. You honestly can use anything that you have on hand. It really makes no difference what you use for your cover. It's just going to be personal preference. Same goes for the inside pages. Now, I just use like a smooth white paper. It's a heavy paper. This is about 160 GSM. But again, you can use whatever you want. You could use a mix of different papers. You could use pattern papers. You can use grid papers. You can use whatever you want. Because of the style that I use in my traveler's notebooks, I just keep things plain with white. I have made traveler's notebooks with colored insides as well. That's kind of a fun look to go for. But today I'm just going to use white. Now, again, the amount of pages that you're going to need is, again, personal preference. I generally keep my inserts smaller. That's because I need them to remain reasonably flat so that I can film for you guys. If I wasn't doing that, I would probably add a few more pages in. But obviously, the more pages you add and the thicker paper that you use, the thicker your notebook's going to be, and so the less likely it is that it's going to sit flat. It probably will sort of flap open a little bit. So it's a little bit personal preference, a little bit experimentation, see what works for you. Today I am using 5 sheets, I think I've got here. Yeah, I've got 5 sheets of, like I said, the 160 GSM paper. So that's going to give me a 10-page traveler's notebook. You definitely can add more than that, but this is the size that I prefer. Now, I'm in New Zealand, which is a metric. My size paper is A4, which is perfect. It's the exact size that I want my traveler's notebook. But again, you can make your notebook any size you want. You are not restricted. I'm making a standard size notebook, which is 8 1/4 inches high. And when I'm finished, it will be 4 1/4 inches wide. But again, you can make whatever size notebook you've got. If you have letter-sized paper, which is going to be 8 1/2 inches tall, I would suggest trimming your interior papers before you start this process rather than at the end. So if you're trimming to 8 1/4, just trim off that 1/4 inch before you start. So it doesn't actually matter how wide your paper is when you're starting. It does matter how tall you want it. So start with the height that you want your finished notebook to be. This is what I've got. So all I'm going to do is start really simply. I'm just going to fold the paper in half. This does not need to be a super tight fold. I literally just want to get it in half. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to trim my cardstock. So I want to trim my cardstock so that it is 8 1/4 inches high as well. This is 12 inches at the moment. Far too tall for my cover. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold this cardstock in half as well. Again, it doesn't need to be a super tight fold. I just want to, it's actually not too bad. I'm just going to trim a little bit off the edge of my cover piece here so that I can see my interior pages. Radio. So that's it. We're ready to start binding a notebook. I'm going to pop my interior pages onto the inside of my cover and then just flatten that whole thing back out again. But I can't, you just want to, that's why we folded that page in the middle, so that we could make sure that that cover piece is in the middle of our cardstock. I just like to grab a couple of like clips and just hold that in place. This is totally optional, but I do find it makes for less mistakes this way. Now, like I said, I prefer a stitched notebook, and this tool here is the We Are Memory Keepers bookbinding guide, and it has been a revelation. I pretty much have not bound a notebook any other way since I got this tool. If you don't have this tool though, never fear, you do not actually need it. It just makes life super easy, and if you make a lot of notebooks like I do, it's a very handy tool to have. But if you don't have it, I'm going to show you another option after I finish binding this notebook. So we're going to pop the little tool open, and as you can see, it's got a range of holes in here, but it only has one set of holes down here. That's the holes that we're going to punch with. Now, I like to punch my holes through the cover to the interior. Whichever way that you're punching on the back of that, it's going to have a little bit of a raised texture. So it's up to you to decide whether you want that on the front or the back. I generally bind my notebooks so that those holes are at the back. Now, I'm going to reverse that fold a little bit, because this is actually indentated just a little bit so that you can align your notebook to the center super easily. I'm going to line it up between these two holes rather than pushing it to the edge. I want the notebook to be centered along these guidelines rather than right up against the edge of it. And then you just put the little pins back in place. I'm not tightening that 100% just yet. I want to make sure everything's in the right place, that everything's centered, and then go ahead and put the other pin back in. They're just like little screws. You just screw them in. They don't have to be super tight. The tool does come with an owl, A-W-L, for punching the holes. But again, if you don't have one of these, it's not going to be an issue. Let me finish this one and then I'll show you the alternative. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to punch the holes that are not ringed in black. So there are lots of little holes in here. This tool does all sorts of different bindings. We are just doing a basic saddle stitch on this notebook. So if I start on the black ones, it's going to be very close to the edge of the notebook. So I want to come in one set of holes from there. And then you can choose how much stitching you do on these notebooks. I'm not going to stitch every hole. I'm going to stitch every second hole. So I am just going to punch down with my owl every second hole here until I get to the other end of my notebook. And that's it. Now we're ready to stitch. So you just take the book out of the guide here. Now, as far as stitching goes, again, you can pretty much stitch with anything you've got. I'm going to use embroidery floss. One tip I do have is whatever you're stitching with, try and add a little bit of wax to it. It does just make it a little bit smoother. It's a little bit easier for stitching. It keeps all those little threads together. I've just got a block of beeswax. You could use a candle, anything you've got, just to make that thread a little bit slippier. The other thing to bear in mind is the color that you're stitching with. I'm going to stitch with white, which looks a little bit stark on this cover, but the reason is because the stitching is also going to show on the inside. So if I stitch with bright pink to match the outside cover, the inside stitching is going to be bright pink as well. And that might be something that you're totally fine with. For this set of notebooks, I am going to use just white embroidery thread. The other thing that I'm going to do to make life easier for myself is I'm not going to stitch with all 6 of these strands. I'm just going to pull this thread apart and use 3 at a time. The other thing you want to bear in mind is not to stitch with anything too thin. The thinner it is, the more likely that it might tear these holes if you pull it too tight. So I find that 3 strands of embroidery thread is a nice sort of compromise between the two. To measure how much thread I need, I'm literally just going to measure up and down this notebook twice, leaving a little bit top and bottom. You do need a bit to work with, a bit for your needle and a bit for like tying the knot at the end. So not exactly the same height. So if you wanted to be perfectly sure, then measure 3 times the height of your notebook. And then I'm just going to go ahead and split those strands. And then to wax your thread, all I do is I hold the thread down with a finger over the wax and then just pull the wax through. And just do that a couple of times. I do like to do the little other end as well. And you get a nice piece of waxed thread. It definitely makes it easier for stitching. It also makes it easier for threading a needle. Now, as far as threading the needle goes, whatever needle you use, I prefer to use like a little embroidery needle, so it's not super sharp. We're not actually punching holes with this needle, so we don't need it to be sharp. And the other thing you want to try and do is get sort of the thinnest needle that you can fit your thread into. We've already punched holes. We don't want to be making them any bigger with our needle. Otherwise, you'll find they get a little bit loose. Now, the last decision you have to make is whether you want the knot of your thread to be on the inside or the outside. I generally put it on the inside just so it looks neater from the outside. You barely notice it on the inside. And whatever side that you choose, that's the side you want to start stitching from. I generally start in the middle, and I want to pull my thread not all the way through. I'm going to leave a couple of inches on the inside, and I'm just going to hold that with my fingers for now, and then I'm going to come back to the front and pull it through the next hole, and then continue that all the way to the top of the notebook. And then once you get to the top hole, you're going to go back through the same holes again. This time you'll be reversing it, and that gives you your running stitch. And then you're back to the middle and repeat that process all the way down to the other end of the notebook and back again. Now, as you're stitching, you just want to make sure that you're not pulling these threads super tight. They just need to be tight enough to hold it together. So you don't want it too loose, otherwise your pages are going to be floppy, but you don't need to be yanking on it either. It's just sort of, you know, hand tight. And then once you get to the middle here, you'll be left with 2 ends, and I'm just going to tie a knot. Then you can trim those threads off, remove your clips, and fold the notebook back in half. So we're almost done. Obviously this edge is not ideal. The next step we're going to do is just trim this notebook down to size. And that's why we've left it longer to create the binding. If you trimmed all of your papers down before you stitch or bind your notebook, you're going to get this sort of raggedy edge. So the way you get a nice straight edge on the notebook is to create the stitching binding first and then trim the notebook. I find the easiest way to do this is with a knife and a cutting mat. I don't have a sort of heavy duty paper trimmer, so this is the best way to get a nice sharp edge. So cutting mat, you can go ahead and measure your, this is the wrong kind of cutting mat for this notebook, hard for you to see. You can measure with a ruler 4 1/4 inches. I know that, again, being metric, my notebook is going to be 11 centimeters. So I can just measure that out. I'm going to line up my ruler with the marks on my cutting mat. Also making sure that this edge is straight along here, and then I'm just going to really gently trim off each page. So I'm not looking to trim all of these pages all in one go. I'm going to run the knife through several times so that I'm not applying too much pressure. You're less likely to make a mistake and hurt yourself that way. I'm just going to do nice light strokes until I'm through all of the pages. And that's it, one finished notebook. So easy. Now I'm going to show you how to do this process without the binding tool. Okay, so I'm up to the exact same process. I have folded my interior pages, I've trimmed down my cover, I folded it, I flattened it back out, and I've added my clips to keep it all together. Now, instead of the binding tool, you're kind of going to make yourself your own little cheats binding tool. So what you need is a piece of cardstock. This is the same height as your notebook, so it is 8 1/4 inches for me. I am going to fold that in half as well. Now you need a ruler and a pen, and we're going to start by marking the halfway point on this cardstock. Basically, we're just going to create our own stitching guide. So this is the halfway point, and I'm going to work my way out, creating the whole guides for where I'm going to bind my notebook. So again, it's personal preference how many stitches you want. I would work to maybe 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch from the edges of the notebook, and then work your way back in. The holes on the binding guide are, I'm going to say they're about 1/2 inch. So this is about 12 to 15 millimeters. So that's what I'm going to do. So with my ruler, I'm just going to work my way along the center fold line in about 15 millimeter marks. So now you've created your own binding guide. Super easy. We're just going to line up the center of this with the center of the notebook. And you're only going to ever need to make this binding guide once. Then you'll be able to reuse it any other time you want to make a notebook. I am going to clip this on the notebook as well, just to make sure it's not moving around. And then you can either use an owl if you have one, or I used to use just like a larger needle or a drawing pin, just anything that's easy to hold and poke a hole down. The other thing that you're going to need is something to poke the holes into. I generally just tend to use, you can use a folded up towel, like a mouse mat or something like this. I've got this like needle stitching case which is all foamy, so I tend to just use that. I also don't want to poke holes into my desk, so I just chuck the cutting mat underneath it as well. And then go to it. Just poke the holes through, trying to keep your needle straight up and down where the marks on your cardstock are. You do just want to make sure that you are actually poking all the way through into the sheets of paper behind. And then when you remove your little cardstock binding guide, you've got the holes and you can go ahead and stitch it just like the other notebook. And then once it's stitched, trim it down and you'll be all done. Now, as far as decorating the cover of your notebook, you can choose to do this before you fill the notebook or afterwards. I generally tend to do it beforehand if I'm doing it at all, and if I'm not, I just leave it plain. But sometimes I feel like I want to just add a little bit of a fancy touch to the front of it. And the one thing that I do recommend is just bearing in mind that you want to keep the front of your notebook flat or flat-ish anyway. As soon as you flip this cover over and start working on the insides, any bulk that you add to the front cover is going to translate to an uneven surface on the inside. So that's just something to bear in mind. What I have done is I have made a few little clusters, just some really flat die cut ephemera from Citrus Twist. And what I've done is just fancied it up just a tiny little bit. You can see I've added a little bit of stitching, some French knots in here. I've done a little running stitch around the edge of this one. And it's all ready to go onto the notebook. So stitching is a great way to kind of add a little bit of texture. You could hand stitch it or use your sewing machine. Super easy. The other thing I love to add is puffy stickers because they are not that bulky and they're a little bit squishy, so it doesn't matter about having them on the front. But a way to get a totally flat front cover is to decorate with stamps. And so today I am going to do both. I'm just going to pop this on fast forward so you can quickly see how quick it is to whip up these 3 notebooks. I'm going to add a little bit of stamping in behind these die cuts and then call this thing done. So for all 3 of these notebooks, I'm going to use really the same basic technique, which is tone-on-tone stamping. I've got a few different stamp sets here from Citrus Twist. I vaguely know the position that my little embellishment clusters are going to go in, and really all I'm doing is just layering up some of that stamping in behind there. So for this first notebook, I added kind of a feature stamp down the bottom. It's a word that says captured. I'm going to add on my cluster. I'm using a little bit of smart glue from scrapbook.com. And then just to add a little bit more stamping in here, I'm going to repeat stamp just one of the tiny word stamps from that same stamp set, just in and around the cluster. Now for this next notebook, I'm using pretty much the same technique. It's that tone-on-tone stamping, but I decided to go with a little bit more of a kind of theme for this one. So I have pulled out my Get Messy stamp set, and I'm going to stamp a bunch of different stamps. So I'm not doing any kind of repeat stamping this time. I am stamping a little bit darker as well. So it's still tone-on-tone, but it's just going to be a little bit more obvious that it's there. It's less subtle. So you can definitely play around with those sorts of things too. I've put my cluster in the sort of position that I want to have it, and I'm being really purposeful about where I'm stamping the other stamps. So my stamping is going to go sort of underneath parts of that embellishment cluster, but mostly it's going around it. So I'm just holding the die cuts down while I stamp in and around there, a bunch of different stamps, and I'm trying not to make it look too messy. This tiny little one, I did struggle a little bit because my Catherine Pooler ink pad here is super juicy. It was such a tiny little stamp. It says magic, so I am going to stamp that a couple of times just to give it a little bit of bulk. And this time I've added some double-sided adhesive to that framed piece because it is quite thick and I didn't think the liquid adhesive was going to work. Now this particular one, I'm going to add one of those little puffy stickers on there as well because it was perfect for that kind of crafty theme of the notebook. And then I'm moving on to my last one. I know this is sped up, but also it does not take very long at all. Now I'm using a couple of stamps this time. I'm just going to stack them up on my block because I want it to say this story. Those are individual stamps, so I'm stacking them together, and then I'm going to kind of create this crazy repeat patterns using these 2 stamps and again with the tone-on-tone ink, and I'm just going to do it down sort of the right-hand side of the cover. So every time I've been stamping these, I just stick a little bit of scrap paper in behind the cover so that any kind of messy stamping doesn't go onto the brand new white pages of my notebook. So I made a couple of mistakes in here when I was stamping, and I ended up having to double stamp over the top of it, but because I know where this little embellishment cluster is going, it's not a problem. I can make sure that I move that, and it covers up any little mistakes and you would never know that they were there. Now I really liked how that little puffy sticker looked on the pink notebook, so I decided to add a couple more to each of the other ones and call it done. And so there you go. In just a few minutes, I've spent no more than probably an hour in here. I've created 3 notebooks. This is going to last me a couple of months at least. And it's so easy. So I hope that you have found some tips and tricks. I hope you give making your own notebooks a go. Honestly, I promise if you do, you'll be obsessed just like I am. Hey, thanks for watching today, guys. If you've got any questions, please leave me a comment. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, and I will see you again really soon. Bye, guys.